Okay, I guess we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome everybody here to the kind of kickoff of our 50th anniversary summer at the Mammoth Site. I can't really think of a better way to kick off our 50th anniversary than having someone here to talk about what is probably one of the most exciting mammoth discoveries in the last 50 years. I'd like to welcome Jeff Bond. Jeff Bond and co-authors are presenting tonight. Jeff is going to present on behalf of his co-authors on Nooncho-God, the story of a mummified baby woolly mammoth found in the Yukon territory. Jeff is from the Yukon. He went to school at the University of Calgary, the University of Alberta. He's got 27 years of experience as a surficial geologist and manager with the Yukon Geological Survey, and has recently pivoted to start his own consulting business called Mammoth Terrain. And he continues to work on glaciated and unglaciated landscapes of northern North America. So without further ado, Jeff, welcome to the stage, and we look forward to your talk.
Well, it's so good to see everybody here. It's so good that we dodged the hail. I declined the hail insurance on the rental. It's a little bit nervous at dinner. Texting Chris, how's? He's like, the radar's good. We're gonna be fine. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's an honor. This is my first time to South Dakota. I'm here with my wife Layla, and it's our first time to South Dakota and the Black Hills and this local area. We had the good fortune of having a beautiful day yesterday up on the summit of Black Elk Peak, and I couldn't think of a more beautiful place. It was absolutely stunning, and you really do live in a gem of a place here. I would like to, you look down on that trail and you look up. I mean, the mineralogy for geologists and the landscapes for geomorphologists, it's just full on. And this was the reaction of my wife throughout the hike, and the muscovite schist was breathtaking. I mean, all the rocks were just stunning. So yeah, it really is a fantastic place. I'd like to acknowledge the Dakota and the indigenous people of the area, and just a land acknowledgement that tonight's presentation is within their traditional lands, and I just wanted to acknowledge that here. I can totally understand why the Black Hills were so special, or are so special to them. Anyways, I'd like to just start with that. My co-authors and co-presenters can't be here. Debbie Nagano is the Director of Heritage with the Klondike First Nation. This is the First Nation where Nooncho-God was found, and she's been leading us fearlessly on the last couple of years. Elizabeth Hall is Assistant Paleontologist with the Yukon government, and I've been working closely with her, and Dr. Grant Zazula, who is the paleontologist for the Yukon government. Typically we're co-presenting a talk like this where we're kind of getting up and sharing our portions of the story, but for tonight it'll be me doing that work. And this story is something a little bit different, I've found, and in experiences I've had over the years. It has so many layers to it, like a mammoth tusk, really, and it's not just about the chance find of a placer miner, digging through the permafrost and finding a mummified baby mammoth, but it's about the reverence of that mammoth with the local First Nation and the scientific community, and how we've come together to manage that and to work on this together. And so there's many, many layers to this, and it speaks to, I think, overall sort of the high regard or the reverence we do have for mammoths. And I know I'm in the right place to talk about that. So it's great to be here, and it's a real privilege. Okay, tonight's talk, I'm going to start off with a bit of background about, just some things about the Pleistocene to start us off, and then we'll get more into the Nunchoga story in a little bit here. But to get going, we are going to go far, far, far to the northwest, up from Hot Springs up to a place called Dawson City in the Yukon Territory, just a little bit east of the border with Alaska. In the capital city of Yukon is Whitehorse, and we have our own sort of Pleistocene exhibits there in the Beringia Center. And this is a center dedicated to the land bridge that once connected Yukon, Alaska with Siberia. And it's a wonderful exhibit. If you ever have a chance to drive the Alaska Highway and you're passing through Whitehorse, be sure to stop in and check out the Beringia Center. It's world class. So Yukon, Alaska, Russia, this whole area of in the glaciated periods of time when sea level dropped really became the crossroads of the continents. And this land bridge was massive, over 1,000 miles north to south. It's a huge chunk of land that forms when you draw seawater up onto the land as glaciers, and you drop that sea level about 120 meters or 400, I guess about 400 feet, something like that. And you create this land bridge. Today, it's of course flooded, and the Bering Land Bridge is about 50 meters below current sea level. But the crossroads of the continents, it's an important area. It's a place where mammoths arriving from Asia would have made their way across the land bridge to the east, arriving in Alaska and the Yukon over 1.5 million years ago. And of course, we contributed horses from the Americas going the other direction. So a really important area where there's all of this flora and fauna that's being traded across continents because of this land bridge. And significantly for local people here, this is also where humans are arriving, of course, roughly 30,000 to 15,000 years ago. There is a migration of people across the Bering Land Bridge and into North America. Today, the Yukon is home to 14 First Nations, Indigenous people, and they're scattered throughout the territory. There's in the south you have the Tlingit people, the inland Tlingit people. You have the Dene people in the southeast. You have the Tachone people in the central Yukon, and the Gwich'in in the north, as well as the Inuvialuit. And it's a really interesting mosaic of First Nation people, and these are all the traditional territories on this particular map. But our story takes place primarily within the traditional territory of the Klondike. These are the folks that lived on the Yukon River at the mouth of the Klondike River. For them, this is the Klondike means hammerstone in the Han language. And hammerstones were these rocks that they used to drive stakes into the river, into the Klondike River, which helped sort of guide and net the salmon that were coming up the river. And so the Klondike River provided these really good stones for driving stakes into the riverbed. And so that's where Klondike comes from. And this is a picture of one of their camps in the late 1890s, right at the mouth of the Klondike River. Of course, the Klondike is also home to some fabulous gold deposits, and placer gold, alluvial gold deposits, and those discoveries took place in 1896 in the Klondike. And of course, there was a mad rush of people, thousands of people joined in that rush in 1897 to 1898, and really you came to the Dawson City area in the Klondike, and this is a picture of some hand miners on Hunker Creek just outside of Dawson City, and there is get my pointer, there is a mammoth tooth on the sluice box. So these folks were starting to understand or realize that there was these incredible fossils coming out of the gravels and some of the overburden that they were mining through. And with time, there was more and more fantastic specimens coming out of the permafrost. And this is a mammoth skull that was found in Quartz Creek. I think it was about 30 feet down. So you can imagine, how do you get that out of sort of the underground mining system? You know, you'd have to have a pretty big shaft, but they managed to do it. And there's just fabulous, fabulous bone specimens that still come out today, and I'll get into that in a moment. Of course, the news of these fossils coming out of the Yukon and the gold fields was also being heard about internationally and realized by some important museums in the world. And so there were trips to the Yukon early on in the early 1900s by these various museums, the Smithsonian, Natural History Museum of Paris, the American Museum of Natural History, to collect specimens and sort of be a part of the storytelling of what was happening there. And so there's a long tradition of scientists coming to the Klondike to look at and study these fossils. And why are they there? They are there, well, partly because there was many of them over thousands of years, but there is a lot of permafrost. And all of that shiny stuff, this is all ice, this is all massive ice. These are ice wedges here, and all of this sediment sort of in between is also frozen, so all the pore space in the sediment contains ice as well. So these are primarily silts and fine sands, and with quite a bit of organic material in them. We call it muck in the gold fields, and it accumulates over thousands of years, and it provides this really, really nice vessel to preserve fossils. When animals die, they get buried by the silt that's kind of moving down the slopes, and then they get frozen and preserved. So there's all kinds of interesting things that come out of the permafrost. And of course, permafrost is a circumpolar phenomenon. We're in the zone of discontinuous permafrost in the Dawson City area. And so there's permafrost in some parts of the landscape, but not all places of the landscape. Like south-facing slopes might be ice-free, but the north-facing slopes would have permafrost, for example, or the valley bottoms. Some of the placer miners use hydraulic monitors like this to wash away that fine-grained sediment and get at the underlying gold-bearing gravel. And it's still used today in some of the family gold mines. And it is an excellent way of recovering the fossils that are preserved in the silts. And it's more of a gentle way of mining the silts, you might say. And so this is a pretty typical way of doing that. And then the Yukon government paleontologists come around. They form relationships with the miners that are really important. They're out there every summer, and they are walking the creek beds where this is happening and collecting bones, thousands of bones from all kinds of animals that lived during the Pleistocene. And so there's a huge record of Pleistocene fauna and that were present in central Yukon during the last ice age and prior, right up, well, more or less from the last ice age right through to about 100,000 years ago seems to be the main window. Some wonderful examples of some mammoth bones that are found regularly in the Yukon. And of course, there's a lot of tusks that come out of the permafrost. They're often very well preserved. This is a pair that came out of Gold Run Creek a couple of years ago. But before we get into the Nuncho-Ga story, I just wanted to talk about some of the, or just show you some of the other fine examples of mummified remains. They're a lot more rare, and they're certainly rare in terms of the in North America. And we do get a bit in Canada, in the Yukon, and in Alaska. It seems like a lot more comes out of Siberia and in parts of Russia. This is a woolly rhino that was found in 2007. As far as we know, they didn't make it over into North America, if I'm correct. They haven't been found in the Klondike. This is a lion cub, American lion, I believe, or no, so this would have been the cave lion. That was found in 2018 in Siberia. Absolutely stunning. Probably one of the finest specimens ever found in terms of preservation. You wouldn't know that this is 28,000 years old. I mean, it just looks like it was, found underneath the house and it's just dehydrated or something like that. But it's just incredible, incredible preservation. I think it had a skull fracture, so that might have contributed to its death. Of course, there's a nice model of Luba at the Mammoth Site Museum here. You can see sort of the scale model of her there. This is the real deal from Siberia. She's a 42,000-year-old baby mammoth, probably the best preserved baby woolly mammoth that's ever been found. She is missing her tail. I think it got chewed off by some dogs at a camp, which is unfortunate, but really, really well-preserved mammoth, and but found out of context. She was found on a riverbank, had been washed out of the riverbank, out of her original resting place, and was found kind of on the side of the river. So there was really no context as to where she was found. Blue Babe, this is a wonderful steppe bison that was found in Alaska in 1979 by a placer miner. And a fellow by the name of Dale Guthrie from the University of Alaska Fairbanks put a lot of work into Blue Babe and reconstructing this. And it can be seen at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. It's a 40,000, actually I think it's 36,000 years is the actual age of Blue Babe. And it's the exact same age as our little baby mammoth as far as we know, or more or less, very similar age. And Blue Babe was attacked, it seemed, by the American lion. They found puncture wounds, and it had opened up one side of the bison, and it probably contributed to its death. And but it was probably late in the season and had frozen, and eventually got covered over. So once it's frozen, it's more difficult to be scavenged, and then it was covered over probably in the spring during runoff. So it became preserved. So it's mostly all there. In the Yukon, this is a wonderful mummified black-footed ferret that was found in 1984, and on the 60-mile river, roughly 40,000 years old. And I didn't know too much about black-footed ferrets. I know that they're very rare today. And in my little bit of research, I realized, wow, like one of the last self-sustaining populations of black-footed ferrets is just over here in the Badlands. And it's pretty neat to think that they were at one time thriving in the Yukon during the Ice Age. At Tony Beats's mine on Paradise Hill, just outside of Dawson City, a caribou was found in 2016, or part of one, and it's roughly 80,000 years old, one of the oldest caribou specimens, I believe, that's ever been found. Just the front half of it. And then also in 2016, a wolf pup was found in the Yukon. This is Jur, and that means wolf in the Han language, the local indigenous language. And this little baby was probably found its demise in a den collapse, they think. They've done some isotopic work on the fur, and they've been able to figure out that there was a diet of fish that was sustaining her during her short life, roughly 57,000 years ago. Okay, on to Nuncho-Ga. We'll start with the discovery and what happened in the Klondike 2 years ago, and then we'll move through sort of the events and the chain of events that have followed. So there's Dawson City. It's in kind of west central Yukon, and just about 60 kilometers southeast of Dawson City in the Eureka Creek Basin is where Nuncho was found. And this was at a placer mine. This is the local setting. This is the mine here. This is Eureka Creek right here. This is the camp. And there's a little draw here that's coming in. Very, very little bit of, just a tiny bit of water coming in this draw. But there's an accumulation of sediment right here that originates from this draw that is accumulated over time. And Nuncho was part of that sediment accumulation. And so the miner, and there's Eureka Creek gravel underneath this sediment that's come out of this little draw. So the miner is interested in eating away, mining back this overburden to get at this gold-bearing gravel underneath the this overburden or this muck. And so I'll just take you on a little flyover. I shot this flyover just a couple days after Nuncho came out of the ground, and it show you sort of what the mine looks like. The site where she came out of the ground is sort of towards the end of the footage. As you kind of will fly over a little hill, you might see some ribbon down in the foreground. The area was roped off for a few days after she was found. And then the video will jump to an excavator gnawing away at the permafrost. And that's important because that is the exact tool that was used when the mammoth was found. So all of this material that you see that you're flying over is this frozen silt. You'll see shiny areas. That's massive ice in the sediment. So it's permafrost. At this point in time, the accumulation of sediment that they've mined down through is roughly about 30 feet thick or 40. You'll see some ribbon coming up, and that's where Nuncho was found. A lot of massive ice around, very mucky. That's the ripper shank. That's exactly the shank that was on the excavator boom. They're basically, instead of washing away the frozen sediment, they are using that. And when Travis Dulowski was using that ripper tooth is when this thing rolled down the bank towards him. Now Travis, he had only been working on this mine for about 30 days. He'd come up from Alberta, he had met the owner down in Alberta, and he was always interested in gold mining. He says, well, I got a job for you. And so Travis, being keen, said, I'll take the job. And Brian had him on the excavator that day, and he was basically trying to square up the cut with that ripper tooth. And so you're kind of down in the bottom of the cut, and you're just trying to square up that lower part of the face that they're mining so they can keep sort of the maximum amount of sort of area as they mine down. Normally, when they're ripping the permafrost, they're using a ripper shank that's being towed or pulled behind on a bulldozer. And so there is no visual for the operator when he's ripping it. But in this particular time, there's Travis kind of using the boom, and he's looking right at the bank. And he'd been told that there was a chance that you're going to find some fossils, right? There's all kinds of bones that come out of this material. But nobody told him about mummified remains. And so Travis, being new on the job, super keen, which I think is an important part of the story because he was very observant. He was excited to be there, and all of a sudden, this baby mammoth rolled down the bank right at him to the foot of his excavator. He didn't know what it was at first. He thought it was maybe a bison or something like that. he got out and, of course, immediately recognized that it had a trunk, and he radioed his supervisor, Brian, or the owner of the mine, and said, hey, I think we got something here that's you should look at. And they came down and looked at it, and he said, we got to get this up to camp right away. And so the ripper tooth had actually dissected the mammoth in half. So the front half was taken up to camp and put in an excavator bucket. They called the Yukon paleontologist Grant Zazula and Elizabeth Hall right away because of this relationship that they already had. They knew who to call, which I think is a super important part of the story as well. And they advised Brian to cover it, protect it, put some insulation on it, and so that until they could find somebody to come and get it. Travis realized that there had to be a back end to this thing, and so he went right back to work and found it and brought the rest of it up. And this is all happening on June 21st, summer solstice, which is National Indigenous Day in Canada, which I think is rather profound as well. So this is happening right midday, National Indigenous Day, June 21st, holiday. Nobody's available, nobody's around to respond to Grant's plea for help to go and get this mammoth. He's in Whitehorse, and he puts out a mass email to everybody he knows. And that is where I come into the story. I was in Dawson City at the time helping some grad students and another colleague of mine, and we were working on landslide stability work just outside of Dawson City, actually just right near the city. There's a rock wall there that's threatening the town, and so we had this master student setting him up with his project. I was spending a week with them there, and this was at the same time, and we were working that day. So we were in Dawson City. We had come back to the work trailer at the RV park, and I said, we got to do half a day in the Klondike, do some gold panning, I'll show you around, give you a few, tips on how to do that, and look at some of the geology. And so we just kind of regrouped back at the trailer. I'm sitting in the truck waiting for those guys to get in, and I start flipping through my email. And there is this plea for help from Grant that came, and I was like, and there's a picture of this mammoth, and I'm like, holy smokes, we gotta help. And so we were immediate, and we were all ready to go. I had a team of people that could help. We had all kinds of tools, and so we set off. And we were there by about 3:30 p.m. It was about an hour and 3/4 drive from Dawson City. And we were all kind of in disbelief as to what we were going to see. We got there, we pulled the blankets off of the excavator bucket, and there in the bottom was this incredible baby. And it took our breath away. And we were like, well, now what do we do? And so I thought I needed to spend a couple hours at the discovery location just down from the camp. And so we put the blankets back on, we regrouped, drove down to the cut, and met up with Travis. And so there's Travis right there, and that's me, and that's my colleague Derek Cronmiller, and that's the excavator that found Unshoga. And they had kind of moved away from the site and to work in a different area for the next little bit, just out of respect. And Travis was able to walk us right over to the discovery location. Obviously, it just happened, and so we got to work. We thought, let's spend a couple hours, get to know the site while it's fresh, and make some observations. Try not to interpret too much, just describe where this thing came from. And so we got to work, spent a couple hours doing that. This is a picture of Holly here. She's picking mammoth fur off of some sediment. So there was bits and pieces of material there. There was a piece of the cecum, that's part of the large intestine, that had been sort of extracted from her when she was cut in half, and that was sitting there as well. So we collected that. This is some of the mammoth fur that was on some of the sediment as well. And we just got to work making some descriptions. I went back to my truck. It was like a 5-minute walk to get my drone up in the air, just to document the site before this dark clouds were coming. And I thought, okay, I'll just race back, get that done. Flew the drone, got like 8 or 9 or 10 pictures, and before the raindrops started to fall, and literally the heavens opened. And this is a couple of videos that were shot by Holly, and I believe it was Dan who was with us. I'll introduce you to them in a second in another slide. But it really, I mean, it ended the field work, that was for sure. Closed the mine temporarily. There was all kinds of rain. This is us loading the mammoth out of the excavator bucket into some Rubbermaid vans during the same storm. And so that was a frantic period in the day. Obviously, we were worried about it getting, thawing, and had we overstayed our welcome? What kind of spirit was this? Is this that, is this, how is the storm connected to this mammoth is essentially what is kind of going through our minds at this point. And we brought her back to Dawson City. This is the sort of the last photo that we were able to take before we put her into a walk-in freezer. This is Dan Shugar here. He's a professor at the University of Calgary. This is his grad student here, Jackson Bodker. This is Holly Baziak, who is assisting Jackson, myself, and then Derek Cronmiller, my co-worker at the Yukon Geological Survey. This was the recovery team. And this is the picture of Nunchoka. We put her back together, probably not perfectly, but got her back together, and I'll show you more pictures of her in a little bit. So ceremonies and protocol. When all of this hit sort of our email channels, it was also sent to the local First Nations, and Debbie Nagano, the Heritage Director, received it on her phone. They were having their celebrations on the waterfront in Dawson City, and taking, it's National Indigenous Day, so there's lots going on for them. A bunch of elders are down there, the chief is down there, there's a lot of ceremony happening. Meanwhile, she notices this email and is completely distracted, and is eventually able to start to deal with it. But it is much more than a scientific discovery. This has launched their interest in paleontology in a much more significant way. This is the Klondike traditional territory here. This is where Nunchoka is from. It overlaps with the Nacho-Nyack Dun First Nation as well, but it's a little less core. It's not quite core to them in terms of the areas. So the Klondike has really sort of assumed guardianship role over Nunchoka. And this is also affirmed in their Heritage Act, which was passed in 2016. This is what we call a settled First Nation, so there's an umbrella final agreement. This is part of sort of the legislation and the self-governance of the First Nation in the territory. So they have their own government, they have a heritage department, they have economic development, they have health and social services, those types of departments within their government. And they are able to pass these acts. Within their Heritage Act, they specify that paleontological resources are part of that. And so in the Klondike traditional territory, paleontological resources are co-managed between the First Nation and the Yukon government. And so the next day there was a gathering at the walk-in freezer. We brought Nunchoka back out of the freezer, and at this ceremony, that we had for her. There was smudging, there was praying, there was a few words by the chief. This is Chief Roberta Joseph here, who was chief at the time. We had a minister there from the heritage branch of Yukon government. There was a number of elders, scientists, and all kinds of different people were gathered there to meet her. And this was a point in time where she was sort of officially named Nuncho Ga, and that means big animal baby in the Han language. And so they were able to gather the elders together very quickly within 24 hours of her being sort of reborn, and developed. They didn't have a name for mammoths in the Han language, so they had to come up with something and develop a name for her. And I say her, may not be a her, we're still not 100% sure, but I'm going to use that for now. And Nuncho Ga means big animal baby. And this is Brian McGoggin. He is the owner of Treadstone Gold. He is the miner that really facilitated sort of the proper initial handling and making the right calls. So whenever we get a chance, we honor, we thank Brian and Travis and Sharon, Brian's wife, for the work they did that day in bringing this beautiful baby to the world. So that was the day after. The following day after that, the First Nation just said, we need to get the elders to the site where she was found. And not an easy feat, because there's quite a few people. And so what they did, Yukon government facilitated this. They flew with helicopters a bunch of the elders in to the mine site. And there was miners from the local drainages that came in as well. There was a few politicians that happened to be in Dawson City for other purposes that joined as well. And we all gathered at the cut. We had lunch, and then we went down to the cut where she was found. And it was extremely difficult to get there. Remember, this is silt that's frozen, and it was a hot day, and it was thawing. And so there was, we were having to use side-by-sides and all kinds of off-road vehicles just to get through the cut to the actual face where she was found. And that's where some of the Klondike elders and the chief performed a ceremony for her, and a smudging ceremony as well, and really sort of properly welcomed her into their presence. It was a very, very meaningful moment. And so this was, it also made us realize that a baby mammoth, it was so much more than a scientific discovery. It was bringing all of these people together that had quite different, places in the local society, right? We had First Nation elders, we had miners, we had politicians, we had scientists. All of these people had a common interest all of a sudden, and around a baby mammoth, which I think that is the power of Nuncho Ga, is the bringing together of people. So the First Nation Elders Council elected, or appointed, I should say, a elders committee that would be in charge of management of Nuncho Ga to help guide her future in a good way. And so there was, I think it was 5 different elders that were appointed to this committee, overseen by Debbie Nagano, and they have really been helpful in sort of, developing protocols, cultural protocols to help guide and steer this whole process in a good way. All right, my favorite part. I won't deny. Let's get into some geology. This first video is just a snapshot, kind of a drone shot, pulling out from the site. So I did that initial work the day of, and then had other things going on, and it came back 2 months later, so kind of mid-August, to do detailed work. So I brought my work trailer, I brought my colleague, Dr. Brent Ward, and we were going to spend a few days totally absorbed this site to get to know it as best we could. So this is the first day kind of working there, and there was a few other scientists that happened to be visiting, so I brought them out to help as well. And at this point, the miner had gone down quite a bit further in depth in the stratigraphy. So instead of like an 8 or 9 meter cut, 30 feet, it was now like 60 feet. And Nuncho Ga was no longer sort of at eye level at the bottom of the cut, but the site was up there where she came from. So it changed. And so my job was to sort of understand all of the context of the geology of the stratigraphy of the site. And so there's the location right there where she came from. There's a person for scale. So all of a sudden we had this pretty vertical, not quite vertical, but pretty steep cut to work on. And all of these, there's like little gullies in here. These are all those ice bodies that are starting to kind of melt back into the face. So you've got to cross these ice gullies when you're navigating this and you're working across. And so I came up with this stratigraphy after this work, and I'll just sort of walk you through what it means. So remember, older stuff on the bottom, younger stuff on top. This is kind of layer cake type stratigraphy. Starting at the bottom, Unit 1 is about 100,000 to 80,000, somewhere in there, years old. All right, this is older stuff. This is a gravel unit. This is what the miner is after, and it's got the gold in it. As they mined back further into the sort of face, so there's the gravel. We knew it was that old because there's volcanic ash in there that helped identify, or we know the age of that volcanic ash. It's roughly 80,000 years old. It's the Sheep Creek tephra. We can use these volcanic ashes to date sediments, and so that really helped provide a really nice marker on that lower gravel. There's also trees in there. And so we don't see trees in the Yukon during these cold Ice Age periods. But during the warmer interglacial periods like today, there are spruce growing up there. And so back in this cut at this lower level, we knew we were into a warmer unit because there's these logs coming out of the bank, these old trees that have been frozen in the permafrost. So there's a picture of Grant sawing one off. We've got some duct tape around it, so we've got this nice little sample of this very old tree. So then Unit 2 is on top of Unit 1. Unit 2, you see this MIS, you don't need to worry about that. That's just an age indicator, marine isotope stage 4. That is a period of time from 70,000 roughly to 46,000 years ago. And that's a cold period. That's an ice age. And so when you have an ice age in this area, you have very little plant. You do have a grassland. It's very much like the prairies. And it is there's not many trees, but there's a lot of dust blowing around. There's a lot of silt, and the dust is generated off the local rivers. It's also coming off the glaciated terrain, the Ice Age, the glaciated areas to the east. This is an unglaciated area. It's never been covered by glaciers, and so you receive dust on the landscape there, and that dust gets washed into the valley bottoms and it accumulates. And so when you're up close and personal with this loess, it's called, this windblown silt. It just looks like massive silt. It's got some soil horizons in it too. You see a lot of rodent burrows in there, and volcanic ashes. And we're able to date this unit using a technique that has also been applied to the Mammoth Site here called OSL. And those ages were wonderful. They're roughly 70,000 to 45,000 years ago. So we've got this there's this Ice Age period that precedes sort of the last Ice Age that's preserved at the bottom of the section. And then getting into the middle of the unit, we have marine isotope stage 3, which is 46,000 to 29,000 years ago. And things are a little warmer at this time. It's still cold relative to today. There's not so many trees growing, maybe a few poplars, but no spruce, no pine, or anything like that. It's mostly a grassland in the Yukon. And it is, but it's warmer. It is a bit warmer, and it's definitely wetter. So this little draw here that we're looking up, that I showed you from previously, there's water flowing in that at this time. And there's sediment being delivered to the sort of mouth of the creek. And we can see that there's the contact between the lower unit, I just mentioned, Unit 2, and Unit 3. We start to see more organics in there as well. Because it is warmer and wetter, we see really nice preserved sort of grasses in there. We see gravel coming out of that little drainage. It's definitely wetter and warmer, and that was when the mammoth was alive. So when was Nunshoga alive? We carbon dated, radiocarbon dated both that piece of the cecum and some of the hair. And those ages came out around 36,000 years old. Very, very close to each other. We're very confident in really, really good dates. And we have some grass from nearby that also had the exact same age. So we're very confident that she was alive and well for a very short time, 36,000 years ago. So then on top of that is the last glacial period, which is again a dusty time, roughly from 29,000 to 12,000 years ago. And in that, there's this beautiful Dawson tephra that was deposited at 29,000 years ago. And that's the volcanic ash that's coming out of Alaska. You find it throughout the Klondike. Okay, mechanism of preservation. How did this happen? And that was really what I was after in that time, 2 months after she came out of the ground. What was responsible for her preservation? And this is what the cut looked like right where she came from when I showed up there the same day. And this is how she was laying in the bank, according to Travis. So her trunk and her feet were facing into the bank. And she was laying on top of this gravel unit here, which is a gravel that's coming out of that little draw. So she's on a stream bed, laying on the stream bed. And in this photograph here, this is the gravel here that she was laying on. And then there's this sort of chaotic unit above her that contains sort of ripped up balls of organic material. And I just described this on day one. And when we came back in August, I was thinking about this in July, actually, and I was like, there's something going on with that unit. We got to focus on it, and we need to really get into that a bit more. I think that's significant to her preservation. And so we started scouring around just laterally from the discovery site in August, and we started to see these clumps of vegetation that were some of them were upside down, some of them were folded, and it was a really, really chaotic unit. And this is my colleague, Brent Ward. Hey, I found something, probably, something like that. But we realized that all of this material that was where these vegetation samples were coming from were within this strange unit that actually looked a lot like a landslide. And so it was debris that had been coming down an old slope, and it accumulated on this floodplain. So we were pretty certain that played a role in her preservation. This just gives you an idea of some of the preservation of these organic samples. So you've got this landslide happening. It's ripping up this tundra vegetation, this grassland tundra, and it's encapsulating it into this sort of silty debris. And it's folding it. Some of it's upside down. We would open these things up, and it was like looking at the Mammoth steppe, the Beringian surface 36,000 years ago, like it was yesterday. It was perfectly preserved, just like the mammoth. And there's a few leaves in there, and there's even chlorophyll in the grass in some places. So the grass is still green. It is like yesterday. Some of this is fabulous preservation. So we're able to collect quite a few of these samples, and for future work. I'm mostly interested in having some of them with her someday. This is the land that Nunchoga's ancestors were walking on, the day that she died. And so that, to me, is very significant, and that needs to be with her someday, wherever she rests in the future. And so what we did was we were able to sort of reconstruct the paleo environment and the geography, the geomorphology of the site. We realized that the creek was down cutting into some of these silts at this time, 36,000 years ago. There's a channel being cut, so you've got steep sides, and it's kind of like a gully, but it's got a bit of a floodplain in it, a little bit of a creek gravel bottom, and Nunchoga is right up against the side, right up against the slope. It's about 20 degrees, and a landslide lets go. We don't know that kills her, but we do know that it's responsible for her burial, and rapidly, and deep enough that she is protected from predation, and deep enough to allow when frost does come in that following winter, that it stays there. And she's frozen for the next 36,000 years on this journey to June 21st, 2022. So it had to be just right, the preservation mechanism for this to occur. And it makes you appreciate sort of how that must have been. But I think this is probably responsible for her death. She was maybe in the wrong place at the wrong time. This gullied landscape doesn't exist today, but it certainly is there in the stratigraphy. And when you think about a herd of mammoths roaming along the hillside, perhaps making their way up Eureka Creek or their way down, they're going to encounter this sort of chaotic landscape at the mouth of this little creek, and they're going to be funneled down these draws, perhaps because they have no other way of sort of getting across them. This is what the landslides look like today that I think were responsible for her demise. We have what's called active layer detachment slides. These happen, or commonly triggered, in high rainfall events. And they'll often turn into sort of retrogressive thaw slumps. So these are sort of much bigger, ongoing, long-lived slides that sort of seep sediment down as the permafrost thaws. I think it was an active layer detachment initially, and then followed by a retrogressive thaw slump over time that sort of filled up that gully in time. But this would be, enough sediment to bury a small mammoth, and preserve her for under the necessary amount of sediment. So let's have a look at Nunchoga. Nunchoga is the best preserved mammoth that's ever been found in North America, and definitely one of the top 3 specimens ever found in the world. And it's rare to find mummified mammoths with trunks in this condition. Her trunk is absolutely perfect. It is as though she was still alive. And when I lifted it up, it was soft, you could move it freely. It wasn't, rigid in any way. It was extremely fresh. One of the defining features of mammoths' trunks are these processes at the tips of the tip of the trunk. These are used for sort of gathering vegetation. They're quite nimble. On a mammoth, they're quite long. On Asian elephants, African elephants, they're shorter. And so this really defines sort of, is one of the defining features of a mammoth, is this long process on the tip of the trunk. Also, somewhat, I think, unique to woolly mammoths is this flange here, also present on the trunk. Then they regard this as almost like a tool in the trunk. It's the mammoth's able to roll up that tip, that sensitive tip of the trunk, and sort of tuck it into this flange during the winter, the coldest periods of the winter, and keep it from getting frostbite. She has her head is relatively small. It's a baby. It's probably 2 months old. Likely was definitely kind of a springtime event. We know there's green grass on the landscape at the time, so probably early spring when she dies, so a couple months old perhaps. Their skulls are quite compact. They're very, very fragile. They haven't sort of developed that real thickness to them yet. There was a little bit of hair on her still. The hair comes off in the sort of freeze-thaw cycles probably that initially happened, and probably, just over time. It was a bit of a damp environment, sort of a humid permafrost environment, and so a lot of the hair had come off and was in the surrounding sediment when she fell out of the bank. So we collected some of it. The miner collected some of it as well to give to us. But there were patches on her. On her armpits, on her back, there's a few little patches here and there. When she first came out of the bank, there was a patch right on the top of her head still that eventually fell off, and it was pretty cute. And her tail, even more rare, I think, than the trunk. The tail was preserved, the short little tail. It's just beautiful. And this is the soles of her feet. Brand new. Hadn't walked much. I would like to believe that this is mud that she put on her own feet, as she was walking across the landscape. This is leftovers from when she was upright and walking, and it's still there. It's a really interesting sole. It's almost fibrous, and it's like woven, and it's grippy. But it's not mature, because as they get more mature, they get cracked, they get thicker, the sole gets thicker, about 1.5 inches, I think, or so. And this one has no cracks in it. It's absolutely perfect. It's about this big around. And on the right-hand side there, that's the picture of her toenail beds. So the toenails aren't present. They often fall off as well, kind of like the hair, right? And they come off in that freeze-thaw process. But her toenail beds are there, so they're really nicely preserved. This is just another shot of her head here on the left. There's a gland that's present, from what I understand, from Elizabeth. That is kind of associated with in the future when she's when it's ready for mating, they'll release certain pheromones out of these glands, and that's part of their mating route cycle, I suppose. There is a bit of a fat hump, although it's not really well defined. On the babies, you do get fat humps, and that's just a storage environment for them to sort of fill up and get through sort of the hard times that would come with winter and so forth. This is the cecum here in my hands, and it had material in it, which is kind of unusual because or surprising, because this baby would be on milk, and it had some green sort of sediment in there, and so there was likely there is plant material in it, and it was pretty dark color, so it was definitely looked like material that the baby had eaten. And according to Elizabeth, she said that's not uncommon in elephants, where they will actually eat mother or father's dung in order to prepare their guts for, with the right biota to really help them sort of be able to process plants in the future. So they're doing that as a sort of a gut preparation thing, not necessarily a sustenance thing. Okay, the environment. This is what northwestern North America and Siberia would have looked like 36,000 years ago. This is a time we're cooling towards the last ice age. We're kind of near the end of that sort of warm period, and we're starting to see sea level fall because we're starting to build ice on the land, and we're getting that connection just starting to form between the two continents right in here. So that's what the geography would have looked like 36,000 years ago when she was alive. We also took samples from the section with a drill. There's a colleague, Scott Cocker, with the drill, and this is right from where the mammoth came from, and we're taking these cores out, and these frozen sediment cores, and we took them from the entire section, from the bottom to the top, did a detailed section right where she came from, and those are being stored at the University of Alberta, and where there's a permafrost repository there, and so they're in safe storage, and we can use the sediment within those cores to begin to understand the plants and animals that were alive using sedimentary DNA techniques. So in every gram or so of soil, there is about 1 billion fragments of DNA from soil microbes primarily, but also from the plants and animals that were alive at the time. And so that's what we've started to look at from this site. And the animals that were around on the landscape on this hillside at the time were ptarmigan, the Yukon horse, the Arctic ground squirrel, caribou, the steppe bison, and of course some other mammoths. And that's what we see in the sedimentary DNA record from the sample that we think is probably closest to her. In terms of plants, there's meadowgrass, dock, bluebell, sedges, plantain, there's aster, no doubt a lot of grass and a lot of flowering plants. This is a rich environment. Today there's spruce, sphagnum, a few birch, and things like that. It's a totally different environment. This is a grassland, and you've got very rich soil with all this dust blowing in and rodents around. I mean, not too different than what we have not far from here. So I think it's pretty cool to think that this whole environment you have here was up there at one time, and then it was feeding mammoths. There wasn't many trees. There is some sign of poplar, probably some aspen. There's dwarf birch and willow, which were common. Remember, we're kind of along a draw there from that little tributary, so there was, a water source, so there would have been some plants like willow around. And that defines the mammoth steppe. So from this period of time, roughly 55 to 60,000 years ago to about 10,000 years ago, we have this grassland that's really rich grassland occupying a huge area of the northern hemisphere, from way over in Europe all the way across Asia, across Beringia, into Alaska, Yukon, and right down here through South Dakota. And so to think that we were all connected by the mammoth steppe for a period of time is, I think, a wonderful thought, and it explains why we've got black-footed ferrets at one time and you still have them here. So why the mammoths didn't persist down here, it seemed like a pretty good place. It's unfortunate they didn't. Are you sure they're not here? It's too bad, but that's the environment that we're seeing in the section, that we're pulling out of the bank, and it really defines this massive biome. So conservation, just this last spring in March, so we've taken our time. One thing that Klondike is really trying to stress is that we're not going to rush into this. As a Western scientist, our tendency initially was to oh my God, we got to do this, and this, and we got to get busy, but the brakes were put on very, very quickly. And they just said, no, we're going to take our time. We're going to consult the elders. We're going to talk to our people, and we're going to do this in a good way. And we're like, you know what? You're right. That's a great idea. And so there was a lot of planning last winter, and in March, and so she stayed in a freezer for like a year and a half in Dawson City on the banks of the Klondike River, and until this last spring. And there was a trip. We did a trip with Nunchoga. And she came down from Dawson City, which is a 6-hour drive to Whitehorse, or Capital City, where you fly from typically if you're going to go anywhere far, far away. And they had essentially not really a parade. It was more of a funeral service in many ways, but there was a procession. And Nunchoga was taken from Dawson City on this flatbed truck with all the elders that were looking after her. And they went through these different indigenous communities, and they had ceremonies along the way. And they honored her as she passed through these different territories. And so we got her to Whitehorse, and she spent the night in a freezer at the university. And then the next day, we loaded her on this prop plane here. That's her going into the front cargo hold of this prop plane. And there were 17 of us that got on board with her. And we put amulets and offerings on top of her case that she was held in. And we flew across the country to Ottawa. And that in a prop plane is a long ways. And it was 8-hour flight with a pit stop in Fort McMurray, which is 3 hours out of Whitehorse, to refuel and stretch our legs. And then we got back in and we carried on. We arrived at like 9:30 p.m. into Ottawa. Foggy night, I couldn't see the runway. We came down hard and heavy, but we made it in. And we had a U-Haul waiting for us. We backed it up to the plane, and we loaded her into the back of this U-Haul. And we took her to the Canadian Conservation Institute right here. This is where she went in. And that is where she's going to be conserved. And she's there currently. She's in a freezer. We had ceremony there. The couple days later, after we had put her in there, we met with everybody that's going to be working on her. And we invited, the Trondaquichin invited the First Nation that is from that local area. So there was two Indigenous groups present, chiefs, some counselors, youth, and we brought her into this boardroom. And we took the lid off to introduce her to everybody. And we had a 2-hour ceremony of smudging and exchanging of gifts. And it was really, really, really well done. And I think everybody was able to really feel her spirit. And so at the Conservation Institute, this is a federal institute, she'll be looked after, and she'll be taken out periodically for a couple hours a day, perhaps, for a wet cleaning and a dry cleaning process to take some of the sediment off her. They worked on the wolf pup in the past, so they did a really good job with her. They've worked on the caribou. Both of these can be seen at the Beringia Center in Whitehorse. And so they will do this cleaning process, and then she's going to be put into a vacuum freeze dryer. That's this unit here. And that's going to take the remainder of the moisture out of her. She's really barely dehydrated. And so there's a lot of her moisture still in her skin. But in order to stabilize her, we've got to get that moisture out. And the vacuum freeze dryer is the right tool, because it'll take the moisture that's in her pores and it will transfer it from solid to a gaseous state without going through the liquid phase. So it's a sublimation process. And that's important because there's less damage done to the tissue if you can accomplish that. So I don't know how long it'll take. Basically, they will keep her in there until she stops losing weight. And all of her moisture will come out into a little vessel down here, which the Trondaquichin wants to keep. So the path forward, just a couple more slides here, folks. Just in terms of sort of what the Trondaquichin are trying to do here. They're really looking at this outside of sort of the scientific process, and they're really looking at it from a cultural lens. They're looking at a healing opportunity. How can Nunchoga bring sort of the people together, the elders, the youth, these different aspects of the community, and really sort of heal and be a union amongst these different groups. So they're really trying to develop protocols. These are cultural protocols that have been lost through the years, and so they're trying to develop some protocols around sort of handling and how do we honor her in a good way. So they had a workshop this last winter where they developed some of the priorities. And so they developed this wheel and had various topics such as Trehude, which is living in a good way, decisions, how the decisions are going to be made, education for the TH and beyond, and preservation process, which has already been started. So this is well underway. But this is sort of going to be a guiding document in a way in terms of how she was managed in the future. I'd just like to close with this lovely painting that a friend of mine completed of Nunchoka just last year. Natalie Parenteau, she's an artist in Whitehorse, and she was inspired by the story as it came out in the news, and she couldn't help but she'd always wanted to paint an elephant. And then Nunchoka arrived to our community, and she was inspired. And this is a picture of Nunchoka here being lifted up by her ancestors and delivered to us on summer solstice. And I think she captured it in a good way. I'm looking forward to seeing sort of her come back to the Yukon. It'll probably be a good year in this sort of conservation process. But I look forward to the day when Nunchoka can be there for the community, can be there for the youth, can be there to inspire people. And that's what it's really about. It's not so much about her DNA signature and her relatives necessarily. It's about how it's going to impact the everyday person, your youth, and how it can really sort of resonate with you in terms of that emotion and that spirit. And so that's what I'm looking forward to is in the future. I've looked at throughout my career, I've looked at, I've never been a part of anything like this. This is icing on the cake in terms of my career at the Geological Survey. But you look at things from sort of the mind and the body, as a scientist. And this process with the Trondakwitchin and the elders has really opened up the emotion and the spirit to what we do. And when you bring all those things together, that is when you can sort of walk and you can live in a good way, I think, in a healthy way, and look at this a little bit differently. So I believe she's leading us on a good path, and I look forward to sort of where she can take us as a community. So thank you so much for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thanks. Happy to take some questions too. Yeah, go ahead.
So that original part that you said that's within the Nunchoka.
Yeah.
Is that consistent throughout other mammoths like Luba and apparatus of the trunk? How do we know, it wasn't impacted from pathologies from the landslide?
From what I understand, it's been found in the other baby mammoths, and so that's been described in the literature. That flange, if I'm correct.
In some of the bigger frozen mammoths
As the bigger ones as well. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so how will this be shared with the
How will this story?
the story and the ceremonies be shared with?
That's a good question. I reached out to the chairman of the Pine Ridge First Nation here and the Indigenous people locally to invite them tonight. I'm not sure if he made it. His name is Frank. Any case, I was hoping that this would be the opportunity to sort of bring sort of some of that story to this area. I think in time there will be, as these protocols and ceremonies are developed and sort of formalized around her, there could be other opportunities to sort of bring those more directly to other First Nations upon request, I believe. So really it's open, right? Like we're open to sort of invitation, and I know that Debbie is really, it's important for her to develop that ceremony, that's the songs, and the sort of the spiritual side of it. So, yeah, how it gets to the people here, I mean, I think it's up to the local people to reach out. Yes.
The mummification process, does science have an idea of how those that mummified because of some circumstances?
Okay, yeah. Well, the sediments that we find in the valleys in the Klondike, like that Nuncho Ga was preserved in, typically we're seeing sort of like 100,000 years of history. So that's kind of the realm, maybe a little bit older. We do have much older permafrost in some of these valleys. Some of the oldest permafrost ever found in the world, a few 100,000 years old, in fact. So there is, but it's, you don't know where those are on the landscape until you sort of dig into them and you do some science on them and you figure it out. But it's common to find sort of that 100,000 to 12,000 year period is kind of mostly well represented in these sediments. So for the most part, she's coming out at a time what's quite prolific. And if we were kind of wagering a little bit as to how old she was, and we thought maybe 40,000 was the age, and so that's a really common age actually. Yeah. Yes.
So you believe that Nuncho Ga died in a landslide, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible that there were other mammoths that may have been buried deeper into the hill with her that we just haven't found yet?
Yeah, that's definitely been brought up, like, where's Mom? And, it's because we're looking at a cross-section of this creek, right? And it's kind of an oblique cross-section. And so as you mine back, you're kind of going up the creek. And they stopped finding good gold shortly after they pushed it back a little bit further. So there wasn't a lot of reason to kind of continue going into that bank. It's very, very expensive to do. And so I don't believe that the landslide deposit is thick enough to consume or bury an adult mammoth. It was about 1 meter to 1.5 meters thick. And so certainly enough to topple a baby and bury it, but not enough to bury the adults. So, but I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, it could have been injured by the process, and then it gets partially scavenged, perhaps, and then some of it's preserved underneath the landslide. It's entirely possible. Now that we've been able to reconstruct this geography of this ravine environment, now we look at all these sort of confluences of small valleys with larger valleys, and we just see this sort of flat land, slightly gently sloping landscape. But now we know that there's this paleo landscape that's probably quite rugged, and that is intriguing in terms of finding other mummified remains, I think. You bet. Yeah. We didn't do any GPR. What is extremely difficult to do, given the ruggedness of the section. And the landscape, she was about 8 or 9 meters, so 27, 28 feet below the surface. It's getting difficult for GPR to do a job. And I'm not sure that would have. And then who's going to dig it out? If the miner's not doing it, nobody's doing it. It's too expensive. And so we did do LiDAR, a lot of drone footage. So it's got really good documentation of the sites. These sites change so rapidly with the melting of the permafrost. once it's exposed. And so happy that we were there, especially day one, because the cut was just so fresh. And even by 2 months later, it changed dramatically. All those ice wedges were melting back into the section, and it's starting to change the angle and everything. So I did some work the following summer, last summer. And then I had to, that was it, like there was no more, I couldn't put my finger on that unit anymore. It had changed too much. And I believe that as it was melting back, we were kind of starting to go up the hill. We weren't going sort of up the draw so much. We were kind of going up the hill a bit, and we lost the landslide deposit. I continued to look at the landslide deposit and scour through it, dig through it. You can only dig back into the section about 10 or 15 centimeters, half a foot, before you hit ice again. It thaws just gradually, and you get a bit of thawed material, you take it off, and then it's hard again. You got to wait a few days before you can excavate anymore. So it's a challenging excavation environment for sure. But we didn't use any of those techniques to advance it. Yeah.
That's another session with the permafrost.
Yeah, from the mining exposure? That's a good question. Have to do some differential work on the drone footage perhaps, but you're getting, a couple centimeters of thawing every, on a warm day on the face, like that much, kind of into the face, and you can sort of peel it off and come back the next day and you got that much more again. And so, it's that rapid. It's changes dramatically, and it's constantly dripping around you. It's a little bit dangerous. Traversing the section for sure. It's exciting. It's an exciting place to work. Yeah.
So does do chemical or isotope signatures get a little bit wonky with the permafrost compared to other, for lack of a better word, like stable sediments?
We did some isotopic work out of this, and we've got a really nice record that is supporting sort of the paleo environment and the temperature at the time. So no, the pore ice in there is from that time that it was deposited. So it's excellent for isotopic work. Yeah, no, it's perfect. Yeah.
What would have been the temperature of
Oh yeah, good question. It's kind of warm. So it's a warm permafrost. So warm permafrost is kind of around, I have to use Celsius. There's no way I could manage Fahrenheit. Anyway, so, 0 is the freezing point, okay? This room's probably 20 degrees Celsius. And so minus, 1, minus 2 centigrade, somewhere in there is warm permafrost. As you got closer to the surface, as they're mining, that permafrost is warming up. It's not melting, but it's going from minus 2 to minus 0.5. And so when she fell out, her trunk was kind of wrapped around her head, and when she fell out down the bank in those first pictures I showed you, that Travis standing beside her, and I was kind of wondering, is her trunk like kind of hard in that position, like still frozen? And, was that swept over her by the landslide, perhaps? Or is it already thawed, kind of in the bank? And I don't know. I've never asked Travis but I know that he laid it out in the trunk shortly after for those photographs. So I think it was very malleable, and so she was quite warm, but but still frozen when she came out, but very, very near the sort of the melting temperature. So yeah, very, very lucky to get to her so quickly and get her back into a freezer within the same day. Yeah, Jim.
Jeff, besides this superb animal, what other things are coming out that might be small? Are you getting other little critters?
Yeah.
Are you getting other animals?
Yeah, the dung. Man, we look for dung. I think we found some. We sampled it, and you'd think there would be a lot, certainly wrapped up in the landslide material, because this hillside's got to be teeming with animals. It's a bit tricky to find, though, for some reason, and I'm not sure why. Maybe we're just not trained in finding sort of the frozen dung. We need Jim up there. But you do find a lot of ground squirrel activity. The Arctic ground squirrel, that's a big ticket item up there. And what's cool about them is, of course, they're burrowers, and they create these burrows underground, and they store this incredible set of vegetation, seeds underground, these seed caches. And when you look at these muck sections, you'll see these balls of sediment here, or balls of organics, and you go up to them and it's just seeds. And sometimes there's a bones of an Arctic ground squirrel in there, but all their seed caches are so well preserved in the permafrost there. So Grant Zazula, my colleague, he worked on that for his PhD, and because that's the plant life that's up top that the ground squirrel's busy eating, and so he's able to reconstruct that sort of floral environment really, really nicely from these macrofossils. Yeah. A little bit from the cecum. The pollen couldn't find much. Wasn't much pollen in there for some reason. We're thinking this has got to be loaded with pollen. This silt has got to be pretty rich with pollen, but there wasn't much in there. We are going to look at sort of like the leaf waxes and things like that might be a little bit more rigid, perhaps. But no, we haven't done any sort of sedimentary DNA. We're actually pulling back on the DNA work a little bit. The Klondike isn't super comfortable with it. Even with the sort of the environmental DNA work, we've got to be really, really sensitive about that. This is the surrounding sediment is really sort of part of her in a way, and they want to do that in a good way as well. So we're kind of putting the brakes on DNA stuff for a little bit until we kind of sort of talk a bit more. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there any type of evaluation of microbiology immediately around?
No, not yet. Yeah, we haven't done that yet. We haven't done any microbiology work associated with her or the immediate surroundings. So that's still outstanding. At this point, we've really been focused on sort of the sedimentary DNA and of course the geology. We still have these plant macrofossils that we would like to have identified at some point. We have colleagues in the Netherlands that specialize in this. And but shipping soil with vegetation on it across to another country in the Netherlands requires some careful paperwork, and you don't want it to get lost in the bureaucracy. And it's too important for us. It's more important for us that those plants are what they are, whatever they are, and end up beside her someday, than for us to lose them potentially in the mail. So we do want, we would really like to have some of that sent to the Netherlands. We definitely want to have some more pollen work done and macrofossil work done on those samples. Not all of the samples are pristine or are really good, necessarily showpieces. We have a few that are, but we would definitely want to get some of that stuff over to the Netherlands in the future. Yeah, I think you're up.
Hey, Jeff, we have 2 questions from our Facebook Live.
Sure.
Where specifically will the baby mammoth be at when she's been preserved?
In Dawson City. And so where in Dawson City remains to be seen. There's no really formal facility like you have here in Dawson City, but the Klondike is definitely going to keep her close to home. And so she will be in that community. They do have a new cultural center that's being built, so I suspect that will be the resting place. And then once the, further discussion with the community happens, it will be determined sort of how and when she's presented for viewing. There's been for the longest time, there's been, talk about a Beringia Center type place in Dawson City where all these fossils are coming out. That is where the miners want to see this. They're the ones that are working with the paleontologists often and exposing the bones and the mummified remains. They would like to see a center in Dawson City. But big ticket items, right, to build these places. So it hasn't happened yet. So for now, Nunchoga will be in the hands of the Trondakwitchin in Dawson City.
And then, do you know how much of her DNA was preserved in cloning mammoths?
Yeah, good question. We don't know how well her DNA is preserved, but I suspect it's pristine. I mean, I just can't imagine it any other way like this. But if the Trondakwitchin decides to go ahead with DNA work to understand her her heritage and her ancestors and where she fits into sort of the mammoth world, then we will know more then. But I don't think there's much interest in sort of making her a part of a cloning process. That's not a priority. That's I think not necessarily living in a good way for the Trondakwitchin. It's my take on things so far, but it could change. Mm-hmm. Any more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
You had alluded to when the landslide fell over on top of the
Yep.
mammoth,
Yep.
there was lots of vegetation.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to take these seeds that have been dormant for 100,000 years?
Yeah. Well, apparently not, but people have tried, and I certainly wouldn't mind trying. But no, apparently they're not viable. I mean, we don't see things sprouting out of the faces of these cuts. I mean, these are really rich sediments. Like when the miners expose these things, vegetation definitely comes in and covers those slopes fairly quickly. But that's stuff that's fireweed. It's coming in on seed stock from the blowing in on the wind, right? And you don't see sort of like an aster blooming on the surface of the muck, the following summer, or a buttercup, that would have been present. So it doesn't seem like they are overly viable in after that amount of time. No. Yeah.
We have one more for Facebook.
Sure.
Are there going to be any replicas made? Like
Yeah, that has been talked about. That has been a priority. So at the Conservation Institute, one thing that they're doing before and during the cleaning process, they have a really good photographic lab. So they'll be doing some, LiDAR scans, I think. They'll be doing all kinds of photography on here. So there will be a really, really good record of her morphology in which that'll enable sort of models to be made. And I know that there's been some discussion with a company that does that, and so I think that that is likely to happen, and I hope it happens because that way at least we can have that, perhaps at the Beringia Center and the White Horse for people to see quite readily. But yeah, that is I believe a goal. So I have, before we wrap things up, I just wanted to say formally thank you to this is part of course the 50th anniversary of your amazing site here, and I've been sort of today I was blown away, like having this tour from Chris in there, going into the places that only the really special people get to go, and and to be able to touch these sediments and start thinking about the evolution of this site. I mean, it's just so much gratitude, to be a part of that. I just wanted to say thank you to the Mammoth Site folks, Preston and Chris, for initiating this and thinking of us, and I wanted to give you a gift. this is a picture that I took of Nunshoga. I have an old camera. I have a Mamiya C33 from 1965. It's a medium format portrait camera. And I brought this camera to the storage place when we were initially, the second day after we opened up the tarp, and we brought her out, and I took a few portrait pictures of Nunshoga, and I just want to present this to you guys in the museum, and thank you once again for inviting me here today. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thank you all so much for coming. I'll be hanging out after if you want to come and chat. And yeah, these guys are doing some great stuff just up the road. Support this place. It's like amazing. It's still has so much room to grow. The internship, the youth they're training is phenomenal. I think they're really doing something special here, and it's a model for many places, and hopefully something we can emulate in the future. Thanks so much for coming.
That was awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Chris. Yeah.
Now we need to go get a beer.
Yeah, right.